What if a single bridge, left standing by chance and failing machinery, reshaped the final phase of World War II? The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was not planned, yet it opened the Rhine and accelerated the collapse of Germany's western defenses. To understand why this unexpected crossing became one of the most decisive moments of the war, we must uncover every miscalculation, every failed demolition, and every rapid decision that turned opportunity into strategic breakthrough. By early 1945, the strategic situation in Western Europe had shifted decisively against Germany. The Ardennes offensive, launched in December 1944 with approximately 200,000 German troops, had failed to achieve its operational objective of dividing Allied armies and forcing a negotiated settlement. Allied forces, numbering more than 2 million along the Western Front, resumed coordinated offensives in January, pushing German units back toward the Rhine River. The Rhine, extending more than 1,200 kilometers, represented Germany's last major natural defensive barrier in the West. German planners assessed that maintaining control of the river crossings was essential to delaying Allied penetration into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, which contained more than 40% of Germany's remaining armaments production. German military preparedness in this period reflected the strain of sustained losses and resource shortages. The Wehrmacht faced significant reductions in manpower, equipment, and mobility divisions that had once numbered 12,000 to 15,000 soldiers now average between 4,000 and 7,000. Fuel shortages limited armored movements, and anti-aircraft defenses were degraded by the loss of experienced personnel. Intelligence estimates warned that the Allies possessed air superiority, demonstrated by more than 10,000 aircraft committed to strategic bombing and close air support missions. The German High Command sought to preserve the Rhine Line by destroying bridges ahead of advancing Allied forces, using pre-planted demolition charges and engineer units assigned to each sector. However, inadequate communication, disrupted command structures, and shortages of explosives created uncertainties regarding the ability to carry out coordinated demolitions. Allied strategic goals were shaped by the desire to accelerate the collapse of German defenses by crossing the Rhine as quickly as possible. The Allies recognized that the river presented both a physical and psychological barrier. Intelligence assessments, including aerial reconnaissance and interrogation of prisoners, indicated that Germany planned to defend all major crossings and demolish bridges to prevent Allied passage. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SAF, estimated that a deliberate assault crossing could require up to 30 divisions, extensive engineer support, and weeks of preparation. Commanders thus prioritized rapid advances aimed at exploiting any structural weaknesses in German defenses or delays in bridge demolitions. Public sentiment across Germany reflected exhaustion. Urban populations experienced continued air raids, including attacks involving hundreds of bombers in a single operation, such as the February strikes on Dresden and Pforzheim. Civilians in the Rhineland faced shortages of food, fuel, and housing due to the destruction of infrastructure and large-scale evacuations. The approach of Allied forces prompted many communities near the Rhine to flee inland. Political authority weakened as communication between regional leaders and Berlin became unreliable. In contrast, public sentiment among Allied nations remained focused on achieving victory. News of progress along the Western Front and the collapse of German positions boosted morale. However, Allied commanders remained cautious due to the unexpected intensity of the Ardennes counteroffensive. Intelligence analysts reinforced the need to anticipate potential German counterattacks and maintain offensive momentum. The town of Remagen, located along the central Rhine, held a modest population and limited industrial capacity, but its strategic importance emerged from the presence of the Ludendorff Bridge, built in 1916 for military transport. The structure featured twin steel arches extending more than 300 meters, supported by fortified towers and stone piers. The bridge remained one of the few operational crossings over the Rhine by March 1945. German engineers had rigged the bridge with demolition charges, but logistical disruptions, supply shortages, and repeated air raids delayed preparations. The local German command, including elements of the 67th Corps estimated that the bridge could be held for several days if necessary, though a full-scale Allied assault was considered unlikely due to the rapid destruction of other Rhine crossings. As Allied forces approached the Rhine, intelligence from forward reconnaissance units noted increasing signs of disorganization among German defenders. Communications intercepts recorded conflicting orders regarding the timing of bridge demolitions. Some German engineers reported shortages of detonators and high-grade explosives, while others expressed concerns about structural weaknesses caused by previous air attacks. The situation created uncertainty that would become critical once Allied forces reached the vicinity of Remagen. These conditions formed the backdrop for the events that would unfold in March 1945. German planners sought to hold the Rhine line despite diminishing resources. Allied commanders aimed to exploit any opportunity for a rapid crossing. The population of the Rhineland faced disruption, displacement, and uncertainty. The Ludendorff Bridge, originally one of many Rhine crossings, would soon become the focal point of a confrontation whose consequences extended far beyond the small town of Remagen. Allied operations leading to the approach toward Remagen began in late February 1945, when units of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, part of the 3rd Corps under the 1st U.S. Army, advanced eastward through the Eifel region. The division, consisting of approximately 15,000 personnel, deployed combined arms task forces integrating armored battalions, infantry regiments, and engineer companies. Their movements followed the collapse of German defenses west of the Rhine, where depleted Volksgrenadier divisions and ad hoc battle groups struggled to maintain cohesive lines. German command structures in this sector included elements of the 67th Corps and the 15th Army, which attempted to reorganize retreating units and establish delaying positions along key transport routes. The opening phase of the engagement at Remagen began on March 7, 1945, when Forward Reconnaissance of Combat Command, BCCB, of the 9th Armored Division identified the Ludendorff Bridge still intact. Intelligence officers had previously estimated that all usable Rhine bridges in this region would be destroyed ahead of the Allied advance. The discovery contradicted expectations and prompted immediate communication with higher headquarters. Major General John W. Leonard, the division commander, authorized CCB to attempt securing the bridge if feasible, emphasizing rapid assessment of structural integrity and the presence of demolition charges. On the German side, command responsibility for the Remagen sector rested with Major Hans Scheller, who had been appointed only hours earlier to oversee the defense of the bridge. The local garrison consisted of approximately 500 personnel, including engineers, railway workers, anti-aircraft detachments, and remnants of several infantry units. Their mission included delaying Allied forces, preventing crossings, and executing the demolition plan. However, German communication lines were disrupted by previous air attacks, and orders from higher command reached Remagen late or in contradictory form. Some messages emphasized holding the bridge as long as possible, while others insisted on immediate destruction once Allied forces approached. As the Americans advanced closer to the town, German defenders attempted to slow progress with small arms fire, machine gun positions, and limited artillery support. Units positioned on the eastern bank of the Rhine received instructions to prepare fallback positions in anticipation of the bridge's demolition. Despite these preparations, several German officers reported concerns about the condition of the explosives installed on the bridge. Shortages of detonators forced engineers to use substitute wiring and improvise connections. Furthermore, earlier Allied air raids had damaged the support structures, complicating the placement of charges and limiting the bridge's overall stability. The initial U.S. approach into Remagen involved coordinated movements of tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion and infantry from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. These units entered the town under sporadic German fire, focusing on securing streets leading to the western bridgehead. American engineers accompanied the lead elements to evaluate potential risks of mines, booby traps, or structural damage. Aerial reconnaissance from nearby Allied aircraft provided additional intelligence on German troop concentrations on the eastern bank, though visibility was occasionally reduced by smoke from burning buildings and artillery impacts. German commanders, observing the rapid advance, attempted to trigger the demolition charges. At approximately mid-afternoon, engineers activated the primary detonator, but the resulting explosion produced only limited structural damage. Contemporary reports indicated that the blast destroyed some wooden planking and damaged steel components, but failed to collapse the bridge. Several factors contributed to the failure: insufficient explosive quantity, waterlogged wiring, and the hasty installation of charges conducted under pressure. A secondary manual ignition system, requiring personnel to physically light fuses, was attempted but disrupted by American fire. The failure of the demolition attempt created immediate confusion among German defenders. Some units interpreted the partial explosion as a signal to retreat toward the eastern hills, while others prepared to resist an imminent American crossing. The local command requested reinforcements, but nearby German units lacked the mobility or manpower to intervene quickly. On the American side, the unexpected survival of the bridge prompted immediate reorganization. Combat Command B shifted additional forces toward Remagen, preparing to exploit the opportunity before German defenders could attempt another demolition. The 1st Army headquarters, upon receiving notification that the bridge remained intact, issued instructions to secure the crossing. At once, engineer units were ordered forward to assess structural integrity and prepare emergency repairs if necessary. These opening moments of the Battle of Remagen established the conditions for the dramatic events that would unfold over the next days. The survival of the Ludendorff Bridge, the disorganized German defensive posture, and the rapid Allied response combined to transform an anticipated river obstacle into a potential breakthrough point along the Rhine. The strategic goals and planning behind the actions at Remagen reflected the broader priorities of both Allied and German high commands in early March 1945. For the Western Allies, the central objective was to establish a secure bridgehead across the Rhine River, Germany's last major natural defensive barrier, before the German army could consolidate forces for a prolonged defense. Planning at the level of Schaff and the 12th Army Group had emphasized multiple crossing options in sectors commanded by the 1st and 3rd U.S. armies. These plans projected deliberate river crossing operations beginning mid-March, supported by concentrated artillery, air power, and engineering units numbering more than 100,000 personnel across both armies. Due to these preparations, American intelligence analysts estimated that an unexpected intact bridge would be highly unlikely. At the Army Group level, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the 1st U.S. Army, operated under directives that prioritized speed of advance, exploitation of German weaknesses, and reduction of enemy capacity to form coherent defensive lines. Under this framework, the 1st Army distributed fuel, ammunition, and engineer resources to forward divisions, ensuring that armored and mechanized units could maintain operational momentum. The 9th Armored Division, although not designated for the main Rhine crossing effort, was tasked with reconnaissance toward the river and interdiction of German withdrawal routes. Its logistic planning included daily fuel allotments sufficient for rapid movement, bridging equipment for auxiliary crossings, and engineer detachments trained in emergency demolition. Mitigation. German strategic planning in the region was shaped by increasingly severe resource constraints. The Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, considered the Rhine the last defensible line, capable of delaying Allied forces long enough to reconstitute divisions and shift units from other fronts. However, the German 15th Army had fewer than 70,000 combat-ready personnel dispersed across a broad front, many composed of understrength, Volksgrenadier divisions, and improvised formations. The defense of key Rhine crossings, including Remagen, was assigned high priority, but shortages in explosives, engineering materials, and trained personnel hindered effective preparations. Hitler's directives emphasized holding the Rhine bridges as long as possible to enable troop withdrawals from the west, followed by their complete destruction at the last feasible moment. Yet these instructions conflicted with the operational realities faced by field commanders. Communications between OKH, Army Group B, and local commanders were inconsistent, with orders sometimes arriving hours after frontline conditions had changed. This fragmentation resulted in divergent interpretations of demolition timing, defensive deployment, and reinforcement requisitions. Plans for coordinated counterattacks were limited due to fuel shortages, air inferiority, and the absence of mobile reserves. German logistical difficulties further complicated their defensive planning. Allied air superiority had disrupted rail lines leading to the Rhine, forcing supply units to rely on truck convoys that were vulnerable to fighter-bomber attacks. Ammunition stocks in the Remagen sector were uneven, with some anti-aircraft batteries reporting fewer than 30 shells per gun. Engineer units responsible for preparing demolition charges lacked standardized materials and often used reclaimed explosives from damaged depots. These constraints diminished the reliability of demolition systems installed on the Ludendorff Bridge, a factor later confirmed by post-battle assessments. Meanwhile, American planning incorporated detailed intelligence from aerial reconnaissance, ultra-decrypts, and prisoner interrogations. Analysts identified that German formations west of the Rhine were in varying states of cohesion, with some battalions reduced to fewer than 200 men. This information encouraged U.S. commanders to push aggressively toward the river, believing that the German defense of crossing sites might be insufficiently coordinated. The First Army planned to conduct river assaults using pontoon bridges, amphibious vehicles, and engineer support units, but the discovery of an intact steel bridge introduced the possibility of bypassing the need for a large-scale prepared crossing. Psychological and propaganda considerations also influenced German planning. Maintaining the perception of an unbreakable Rhine defense was considered vital to sustaining morale among both troops and civilians. Orders stressed the symbolic significance of preventing Allied forces from reaching the eastern bank. However, this symbolic emphasis sometimes overshadowed more practical measures, such as preemptive withdrawal or tactical demolitions. The German leadership sought to instill confidence through radio broadcasts and internal directives, claiming imminent stabilization of the front, but frontline reports consistently indicated declining combat readiness. American planners, cognizant of the potential for German desperation, anticipated heavy resistance at all Rhine crossings. The expectation of formidable defenses contributed to the shock value of finding the Ludendorff Bridge intact. Once intelligence from Remagen confirmed its survival, planning shifted from a reconnaissance-driven posture to an immediate exploitation strategy. This pivot required rapid reassignment of supporting artillery, engineer units, and reconnaissance teams to reinforce the 9th Armored Division's efforts. Communication lines between division, corps, and Army headquarters were utilized to coordinate the reallocation of bridging equipment, medical facilities, and supply convoys into the sector. As the situation evolved, both sides made rapid strategic adjustments shaped by incomplete information, conflicting directives, and the accelerating pace of operations. For the Americans, the strategic objective of securing an early Rhine crossing aligned perfectly with the opportunity presented. For the Germans, the plan to delay and destroy had already been compromised by logistical shortages and weakened defensive structures. These contrasting approaches set the stage for the forthcoming engagements at the bridge itself, where planning failures and unexpected opportunities would converge into one of the most consequential moments of the Western Front in 1945. American forces approached the Ludendorff Bridge under continuous small arms fire, indirect mortar strikes, and isolated attempts by German defenders to delay their advance. The terrain around the western abutment forced units of the 9th Armored Division to move along narrow access roads and exposed open ground, leaving them vulnerable to the defenders positioned in elevated areas near the Erpellerlei Ridge. German officers directing the defense attempted to maintain overlapping fields of fire from machine gun nests and rifle squads, but the limited manpower and the fragmentation of units under their control reduced the overall coherence of their efforts. Reports from the American front lines indicated that most German positions contained no more than 5 to 10 soldiers each, many of them from replacement battalions or convalescent formations lacking heavy weapons. As the Americans advanced, they encountered roadblocks constructed from debris, overturned carts, and damaged vehicles. Engineers attached to the 9th Armored Division began clearing obstacles while infantry squads provided covering fire. These delays forced the Americans to proceed carefully, but they also revealed the defensive pattern German troops had adopted: a series of short-holding actions, each designed to buy a few additional minutes for demolition teams attempting to destroy the bridge. The Americans noted bursts of smoke near the eastern tower of the structure, suggesting ongoing attempts to modify or reinforce explosive charges. This heightened the urgency of the advance. The first close-range firefights erupted near the western bridge tower, where German defenders held fortified positions supported by several machine guns positioned along the bridge's pedestrian walkways. These positions allowed them to fire down the length of the bridge while remaining partially shielded by the superstructure. American infantry responded with suppressive fire from Browning automatic rifles, while tank crews attempted to neutralize firing points with high explosive rounds. Some of these rounds struck the steel trusses but failed to dislodge the defenders. Nevertheless, the pressure forced German troops to fall back toward the eastern side of the structure. Inside the Erpelairlay tunnel, German command personnel attempted to coordinate the defense while managing the evacuation of wounded soldiers and civilian refugees seeking shelter. The tunnel, nearly 300 meters long, contained makeshift medical stations, ammunition storage points, and communication posts connected by field telephones. However, as American fire intensified and additional U.S. units approached from the south, these communications began to break down. German officers struggled to obtain accurate information on enemy movements, and contradictory reports from outlying positions added to the confusion. The critical moment occurred when German engineers initiated the second major attempt to demolish the bridge. They detonated a series of charges placed directly on the structure's support beams. The explosion tore a crater into the roadway and damaged several lateral struts, but failed to collapse the span. American observers reported a large cloud of dust and debris rising from the central portion of the bridge, but through binoculars they could still see the main steel arches intact. The failure resulted from a combination of improvised explosives, insufficient quantities of TNT, and damaged detonation circuits. American officers immediately recognized that the window of opportunity remained open. American infantry began crossing the bridge in small teams, taking advantage of gaps in German fire caused by the failed demolition attempt. The first crossing units consisted of approximately 40 soldiers from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. They advanced in a crouch formation, using the steel beams as partial cover. German machine gun crews located on the eastern bank attempted to halt the crossing with sustained bursts, but their positions lacked the necessary ammunition reserves to maintain continuous fire. Several explosive shells detonated near the walkway, causing casualties among the advancing Americans. Yet, the crossing continued. Simultaneously, American engineers assessed the damage inflicted by the explosion. They identified a fractured support beam and a weakened section of the decking, but concluded that the structure could still support additional personnel. They marked hazardous areas with tape and hand signals, guiding follow-on units toward more stable sections of the bridge. On the German side, attempts to reinforce the defense with reserve units were hampered by destroyed road links and congestion caused by retreating troops moving deeper into the Rhine Valley. Fighting intensified on the eastern abutment as the first American soldiers reached the far side. They engaged German defenders positioned behind sandbags, in trenches, and along the southern rail embankment. With their lines under pressure, German commanders ordered a withdrawal toward predetermined fallback positions, located several hundred meters east of the river. During this phase, German artillery located on higher ground attempted to disrupt the crossing with indirect fire. However, due to limited ammunition stocks, often fewer than 20 shells per gun, the overall impact was inconsistent and short-lived. The capture of the eastern tower of the Ludendorff Bridge marked a decisive moment in the early engagements at Remagen. Within minutes, additional American units began crossing, increasing the volume of fire directed at withdrawing German troops. Although the bridge remained damaged and structurally compromised, it continued to stand, enabling a continuous flow of infantry to establish a foothold on the eastern bank. This development created the first intact Allied bridgehead across the Rhine, an outcome both unexpected and strategically significant for the subsequent phases of the campaign. As American forces consolidated their initial foothold east of the Rhine, German commanders attempted to re-establish control over the sector through rapid countermeasures. The German High Command transferred responsibility for the region to Army Group B, which ordered available units, many of them fragmented formations or emergency battalions, to converge on Remagen and seal. The breach reports from field headquarters indicate that the total number of German personnel redirected toward the sector between 8 and 10 March reached approximately 5,000 to 6,000 troops, drawn from the 67th Corps, remnants of the 106th Panzer Brigade, elements of the 11th Panzer Division, and Volkssturm detachments from nearby towns. However, the majority arrived in small, uncoordinated groups without heavy weapons or armored support. American units positioned around the bridgehead recorded frequent but disjointed enemy attacks, originating from elevated terrain near the villages of Erpel, Orsburg, and Kasbach. These assaults were conducted by infantry platoons operating without air cover and with limited artillery preparation. Several attacks reached American forward defensive lines, resulting in localized exchanges of rifle and machine gun fire. Nevertheless, the absence of concentrated force prevented the Germans from mounting a sustained effort, capable of dislodging the U.S. troops forming the perimeter east of the river. By the evening of March 9th, the Americans had expanded their positions by capturing additional ground, extending roughly 800 to 1,000 meters inland. Meanwhile, the structural condition of the Ludendorff Bridge continued to deteriorate under the combined impact of previous demolition charges, artillery hits, and the constant vibration caused by troop movements. U.S. engineers monitored the deformation of support beams using improvised measuring equipment and noted increasing lateral shifts. Reinforcement efforts began immediately. Timber, steel beams salvaged from nearby rail lines, and sandbags were brought forward from the West Bank to stabilize the compromised sections of the decking. Over 300 engineers worked in rotations, maintaining continuous repair operations despite intermittent German artillery fire directed at the span. German artillery units stationed on higher ground, including batteries equipped with 105mm and 150mm howitzers, attempted to disrupt both the bridge crossings and repair efforts. Due to ammunition shortages, many batteries reported fewer than 30 shells per gun. The bombardment lacked sustained intensity. Nonetheless, several rounds scored direct or near-direct hits on the bridge structure, causing additional fractures in the steel framework. American engineers recorded at least 25 structural impacts over a 48-hour period. Despite these challenges, the flow of U.S. reinforcements continued, with approximately 8,000 troops crossing the bridge by the end of 10 March. In response to the American presence east of the Rhine, the German Luftwaffe initiated aerial attacks aimed at destroying the bridge. These operations involved fighter bombers from 3/JG2 and dive-bombing elements from SG4. Between 9 and 12 March, German aircraft conducted more than 40 sorties against the target, deploying high-explosive bombs of 250 to 500 kilograms. Anti-aircraft defenses on the American side included multiple 40mm Bofors guns, .50 caliber machine guns, and several mobile 8AA units positioned along the riverbanks. The intensity of American anti-aircraft fire forced many German pilots to release their ordnance from higher altitudes, reducing accuracy. Only one bomb achieved a near miss close enough to damage the embankment, and none achieved a direct hit on the bridge. A new threat emerged as German forces deployed the WV-2 rocket in an attempt to eliminate the structure. These ballistic missiles, launched from sites located over 200 kilometers away, targeted the Remagen area beginning on March 12th. Although two V-2s landed within several kilometers of the bridge, the lack of precision inherent to the missile system prevented any significant damage to the structure or the American buildup around it. U.S. sources documented the psychological impact of these strikes, noting the sudden explosions and large craters produced by the missiles. However, operationally, the attacks failed to alter the course of the engagement. While German commanders continued to reinforce the area, they faced mounting logistical constraints. Destroyed rail lines and Allied air superiority disrupted the movement of supply trains, forcing many units to travel by road under threat of aerial attack. Fuel shortages further limited the deployment of armored vehicles, resulting in the arrival of only a handful of tanks and self-propelled guns by mid-March. In contrast, the U.S. Army expanded its bridgehead through coordinated offensives conducted by units of the 9th Armored Division, supported by artillery and engineering battalions positioned on the western bank. By 12th March, American forces had established a bridgehead approximately 3 kilometers deep and 5 kilometers wide. Defensive positions were reinforced with barbed wire, anti-tank mines, and interconnected foxholes, ensuring the sustainability of the position against potential German counterattacks. Observations made by American command indicated that German assaults increasingly relied on hastily assembled infantry units lacking heavy weapons and coherent operational direction. The inability to organize a sustained counteroffensive allowed the Americans to prepare for the next phase, expanding the bridgehead and integrating additional divisions into the sector. The continuing German attempts to destroy the bridge underscored the significance attributed to the structure by both sides. For the Americans, it represented a rare opportunity to establish a Rhine crossing without the need for complex assault operations or pontoon construction under fire. For the Germans, its survival threatened the integrity of the entire defensive line along the river. As both sides reassessed their positions, the situation at Remagen shifted rapidly toward the larger operational consequences that would unfold over the coming days. As the bridgehead expanded, the intensity of combat around Remagen reached its peak. German High Command ordered a coordinated effort to eliminate the American position through combined artillery, infantry, and armored attacks. The concentration of German forces in the sector increased to an estimated 15,000 to 17,000 troops by 14th March, consisting of elements from the LX-5 AII Corps, the 11th Panzer Division, the 9th Panzer Division, the 106th Panzer Brigade, and several Volksgrenadier units. However, many formations arrived in fragmented condition, with battalions frequently numbering fewer than 200 soldiers and possessing minimal armored support. In contrast, the Americans steadily reinforced their positions, increasing the total strength of troops east of the Rhine to roughly 12,000 by 15th March, backed by additional artillery and logistical units on the western bank. German commanders prepared several counterattacks, aimed at compressing and eventually destroying the American bridgehead. These efforts typically began with small-scale artillery bombardments, followed by infantry advances attempting to exploit gaps between American defensive positions. One of the most significant efforts occurred on March 13th, when German forces attempted a concentrated attack toward the village of Erpel. Approximately 1,000 German soldiers, supported by a limited number of armored vehicles, advanced under cover of fog and smoke. They managed to penetrate the initial American outposts, forcing U.S. forces to fall back several hundred meters. However, once the weather cleared, American artillery units directed fire on the German advance, using forward observers stationed in elevated positions. Halting the momentum, the Germans withdrew, after sustaining dozens of casualties and losing several armored vehicles. The German Luftwaffe continued to attempt precision strikes on the Ludendorff Bridge during this period. By mid-March, Luftwaffe reports noted the deployment of approximately 120 aircraft from various units over multiple days, ranging from Me-109s and FW-190s to Ju-87s, dive bombers. Despite the number of attempts, the combination of heavy anti-aircraft fire, smoke screens deployed by American engineers, and the structural resilience of the bridge itself prevented any direct hits. Pilots reported difficulty identifying the target due to the defensive measures, and bomb release altitudes often exceeded 2,500 meters, drastically reducing accuracy. The Luftwaffe's inability to destroy the bridge through conventional air raids marked a significant operational failure, contributing to the continued American expansion east of the Rhine. Artillery fire remained a persistent threat. German howitzers, primarily 105mm and 150mm guns, attempted sustained bombardments, firing more than 600 shells at the American bridgehead and the bridge itself between 11 and 16 March. Several shells impacted the bridge, causing additional cracks, twisted beams, and dislodged plates. The cumulative effect placed increasing strain on the structure, threatening its long-term viability. American engineering battalions reinforced the bridge with additional steel, timber, and sandbags, but they noted growing warping and vibration during troop crossings. Reports indicated measurable sagging in several key beams, prompting engineers to consider limiting heavy vehicle traffic. Meanwhile, American command decisions focused on increasing the depth and width of the bridgehead to ensure its survivability. The 9th Armored Division received additional support from the 78th Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division, both of which began crossing the bridge in staggered formations. These units pushed eastward toward the towns of Bruchhausen, Hüningen, and Rheinbreitbach, establishing new defensive lines and reducing the vulnerability of the original bridgehead perimeter. Artillery positions west of the Rhine provided a steady volume of fire, with U.S. batteries firing thousands of rounds to counter German movements and suppress enemy positions. German commanders recognized that without a decisive breakthrough, the American bridgehead would soon become too large to eliminate. Nevertheless, they continued efforts to deliver focused counterattacks. One of the most serious attempts arose when elements of the 11th Panzer Division launched a coordinated nighttime assault aimed at disrupting American supply lines near the central sector of the bridgehead. The attack involved several tanks and armored personnel carriers supported by infantry. While the German armor achieved initial progress, destroying several American vehicles and advancing nearly 1 kilometer, U.S. artillery and anti-tank units quickly responded. Within hours, the German force withdrew after losing multiple armored vehicles. The Luftwaffe introduced a new weapon in its efforts to destroy the bridge: the Meistel composite aircraft, consisting of a piloted fighter attached to an explosive-laden drone. Several Meistel missions were launched toward Remagen in mid-March, each carrying a ton-scale warhead designed to destroy heavily fortified targets. However, the aircraft struggled with navigation difficulties, radio interference, and heavy anti-aircraft fire. None reached the intended target. One crashed far north of the bridge, while another failed to separate properly and crashed before reaching the river. The Americans continued strengthening their infrastructure around the bridgehead. Additional pontoon bridges were constructed downstream to increase the flow of troops and supplies. Heavy vehicles, including Sherman tanks, self-propelled artillery, and supply trucks, were rerouted to these temporary structures to reduce strain on the Ludendorff Bridge. The expansion of bridging infrastructure ensured that even if the original structure failed, the operational momentum east of the Rhine would not be halted. By the end of 16th March, the peak phase of the Remagen fighting demonstrated the limits of German capacity to reverse the situation. Despite deploying thousands of troops, dozens of aircraft, multiple artillery batteries, and specialized weapons, German forces remained unable to halt the American advance. The bridge continued to stand, heavily damaged but operational, symbolizing both the unexpected American success and the growing strategic crisis confronting the German defenders. American forces used the period after the peak engagements to reorganize their positions and adapt to the evolving tactical environment. As additional divisions crossed the Rhine through the pontoon bridges constructed downstream, the character of the engagement shifted from a struggle to preserve a narrow foothold to a broader effort aimed at consolidating and expanding control over the surrounding region. The Americans began integrating fresh infantry and armored units into coordinated offensives, while engineers expanded logistical routes to sustain operations east of the river. Supply lines were strengthened through a continuous flow of ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical support from the Western Bank. This ensured that units positioned within the bridgehead could maintain operational readiness despite ongoing German attempts to disrupt their positions. German forces, facing mounting pressure, attempted to reorganize and adapt to the new conditions created by the growing Allied presence. Commanders within Army Group B sought to regroup scattered units into coherent battle groups capable of conducting local counterattacks. These ad hoc formations included mixed elements from the 11th Panzer Division, remnants of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, Volksgrenadier regiments, and replacement battalions drawn from training depots east of the Rhine. Despite numerical reinforcements, many of these units lacked adequate transportation, heavy artillery, or armored support. The fragmentation of the German force structure limited its ability to launch coordinated countermeasures. German artillery continued to bombard American positions, focusing on areas identified as logistical centers, such as supply dumps, command posts, and temporary medical stations. However, careful camouflage, dispersion of resources, and constant relocation minimized the impact of these attacks. American counter-battery fire, coordinated through sound-ranging equipment and aerial reconnaissance, steadily reduced the operational effectiveness of German artillery batteries. Units positioned on elevated ground near Linz and Unkel reported ammunition shortages and increasing difficulty relocating guns due to damaged transport vehicles and fuel scarcity. The Luftwaffe continued operations against the Remagen sector, though the frequency of sorties decreased significantly. Fuel shortages, aircraft losses, and maintenance issues reduced the operational strength of German air units available for the mission. As a result, attacks shifted from large-scale bombing attempts to smaller harassment operations, conducted by individual or paired fighter bombers. These attacks aimed to disrupt American troop movements, but rarely achieved measurable tactical results. American anti-aircraft defenses grew more effective as additional units moved into the region, creating a layered network of fire that discouraged low-altitude approaches. American forces advanced beyond the immediate vicinity of the bridgehead, targeting strategic villages and transportation nodes to prevent German forces from concentrating for renewed assaults. Patrols and reconnaissance units pushed into the surrounding hills and forests, mapping German defensive positions and identifying weak points. Captured German documents and interrogations revealed a deteriorating command structure, with several units reporting conflicting orders or no contact with higher headquarters for extended periods. These findings confirmed American assessments that German resistance, while still capable of inflicting casualties, lacked the organization needed to launch sustained counteroffensives. Engineers continued reinforcing the bridgehead defenses with anti-tank obstacles, minefields, interconnected trenches, and machine gun nests. New observation posts were established on high ground to monitor German movements. American units implemented rotation schedules to reduce fatigue and maintain consistent defensive strength. Medical evacuation routes were expanded, allowing rapid transport of wounded personnel to hospitals west of the Rhine. These adaptations ensured that despite ongoing pressure, the American position remained stable and increasingly resilient. German forces attempted several localized counterattacks during this period, typically involving company-sized or battalion-sized groups aiming to exploit perceived gaps in American lines. One such attempt occurred near the village of Höningen, where German infantry supported by a small number of armored vehicles advanced toward American positions during the early morning hours. Although they briefly disrupted an American outpost, the attack stalled after encountering concentrated small arms fire and artillery. The withdrawal was complicated by logistical issues, including damaged roads and lack of armored recovery vehicles, resulting in the abandonment of several German vehicles. In the days that followed, American units continued to advance methodically, capturing additional territory and pushing German forces farther from the bridgehead perimeter. These gains reduced the effectiveness of German artillery fire and isolated several German units from their supply sources. The American presence expanded to control key crossroads, river access points, and high ground, effectively anchoring the bridgehead and enabling further offensive operations. Resistance movements in the region also observed the shifting balance of power. While their direct role remained limited near the active front, reports indicated increased communication between local groups and advancing American units. German security forces diverted personnel to manage these internal threats, further stretching available resources and complicating their defensive planning. By mid-March, the battle around Remagen had entered a phase defined by German attempts to delay and contain, rather than decisively counterattack. American forces adapted effectively by expanding their positions, integrating additional divisions, and mitigating the effects of German artillery and air raids. The growing depth of the bridgehead reduced the possibility of its elimination and positioned the Allies to initiate broader offensive operations into the interior of Germany. The next phase would be shaped not only by battlefield engagements, but also by the increasingly precarious condition of the Ludendorff Bridge itself. The turning point in the Battle of Remagen emerged through a combination of structural failure, operational momentum, and the evolving strategic situation across the Western Front. By 17th March, the Ludendorff Bridge had endured nearly 10 days of continuous strain from troop movements, demolition damage, artillery impacts, and multiple near misses from air attacks. American engineers recorded progressive deformation in several primary support beams, noting an increase in measured deflection compared to earlier assessments. Vibrations intensified with every crossing, especially when infantry and vehicles moved simultaneously. These conditions placed the bridge at risk of sudden collapse, compelling American commanders to review evacuation pathways and establish additional pontoon crossings as contingency routes. German forces attempted to exploit the precarious condition of the bridge through renewed bombardment. Artillery units employing 150 mm and 170 mm guns targeted the structure with the intent to accelerate its failure. Although several shells struck the riverbanks and nearby defensive positions, only a small number hit the bridge directly. Nevertheless, these impacts added incremental stress to the already compromised steel framework. German commanders believed that destroying the bridge could temporarily isolate American forces east of the Rhine and delay further Allied advances. The German High Command therefore continued issuing orders for intensified attacks despite diminishing resources and limited prospects of success. American engineers undertook emergency stabilization efforts by reinforcing weakened areas with timber beams, steel plates, and sandbags. They also implemented new restrictions on the weight and spacing of units crossing the bridge, limiting heavy vehicle use, and imposing intervals between infantry groups. Observational teams monitored stress indicators and recorded a noticeable increase in audible cracking within the structure. These developments underscored the urgency of completing alternative crossing points. By March 17th, 2 pontoon bridges had reached operational status, enabling the redirection of vehicular traffic and reducing the load on the original bridge. Simultaneously, German High Command initiated further unconventional attempts to bring down the bridge. One such attempt involved deploying frogmen from the Kampfschwimmer unit, trained to approach underwater and attach explosive charges directly to vital points of the structure. These swimmers entered the river under cover of darkness, but strong currents, flood conditions, and extensive American patrol activity hindered their progress. Several were detected and captured before reaching the target. American reports noted increased vigilance along the riverbanks, with searchlights and patrol boats scanning continuously for signs of underwater activity. The decisive moment occurred on March 17th at approximately 1500 hours when the Ludendorff Bridge suddenly collapsed. American engineering logs indicate that structural failure began with the buckling of one of the main support beams, followed by the rapid sequential collapse of adjacent elements. The central segment of the bridge fell into the Rhine, sending debris, steel trusses, and several American soldiers into the water. Engineers later concluded that accumulated stress, combined with previous demolition, damage, and repeated artillery impacts, caused the structure to exceed its load-bearing capacity. German artillery fire may have contributed indirectly, though no single impact at the time of collapse was recorded. The collapse resulted in the deaths of a number of American engineers and soldiers working on or near the structure, with additional personnel injured by falling debris or swept downstream. Despite the loss, the operational impact proved far less severe than German commanders had anticipated. By the time the bridge fell, the majority of American divisions scheduled to cross had already moved east of the Rhine, and the newly constructed pontoon bridges ensured the continued flow of reinforcements. The collapse affected logistical efficiency, but did not halt or reverse the American advance. German forces attempted to capitalize on the situation by launching localized attacks aimed at probing the perimeter of the American bridgehead. However, these efforts encountered well-fortified positions supported by artillery, armor, and reserves. The Americans repelled each assault, often inflicting casualties on German units attempting to regroup or withdraw. Reports from German commanders described growing difficulties in coordinating operations due to fragmented communications and the dispersal of units across multiple fronts. The strategic significance of the collapse lay not in the disruption it caused, but in the broader context of the campaign. American divisions continued advancing deeper into Germany, supported by secure supply lines and overwhelming logistical capacity. The bridgehead at Remagen served as a launch point for operations toward key objectives such as the Sieg River, the Westerwald region, and ultimately the encirclement of the Ruhr German forces, depleted by earlier counterattacks and strained by shortages in fuel, ammunition, and equipment, were increasingly unable to contest these advances. The collapse also underscored the limitations of German countermeasures. Despite deploying aircraft, artillery, special operations units, and ballistic missiles, German forces had been unable to prevent the Americans from securing a Rhine crossing and establishing a significant foothold on the eastern bank. The loss of the bridge therefore symbolized the diminishing capacity of German military power at this stage of the war. In the days following the collapse, American engineers focused on expanding and reinforcing alternative bridging routes to ensure uninterrupted logistical support. Additional pontoon bridges and Bailey bridges were constructed at multiple points along the river, further reducing reliance on any single crossing. As the American position solidified and expanded, German forces retreated towards secondary defensive lines deeper within the Rhineland, marking a shift from attempted counteroffensives to delaying actions designed to slow the Allied advance. The turning point at Remagen was thus defined not by the collapse of the bridge itself, but by the irreversible shift in operational momentum. The United States Army had successfully crossed the Rhine, secured a durable bridgehead, and demonstrated its capacity to sustain large-scale operations. Despite enemy resistance and structural setbacks, German attempts to reverse the situation proved increasingly ineffective, signaling a decisive shift in the campaign for Western Germany. In the aftermath of the bridge's collapse, the focus of operations around Remagen shifted from maintaining the crossing to consolidating the broader advance into central Germany. American forces already positioned east of the river continued to push outward, expanding their control over key roads, rail corridors, and settlements that would serve as staging areas for further offensives. Units from the 9th Armored Division, 78th Infantry Division, and 99th Infantry Division advanced toward the Sieg River, encountering intermittent resistance from German rearguard forces attempting to delay the American approach. These rearguard elements typically consisted of small infantry groups supported by limited numbers of anti-tank guns or machine gun positions. They engaged in short defensive actions before retreating deeper into the interior, reflecting an operational shift toward delaying tactics rather than attempting decisive engagements. German commanders, facing the loss of the Remagen crossing and the continued expansion of American forces, reorganized their remaining units to avoid encirclement elements of the 67th Corps, and nearby formations began withdrawing toward the defensive line formed around the Sieg River and the Westerwald region. Reports from German field units described chaotic conditions during these withdrawals, with congested roads, damaged bridges, and fuel shortages complicating movement. Several units abandoned heavy equipment due to mechanical failures or lack of towing capability. The deteriorating condition of German command infrastructure meant that many units operated with limited communication, relying on messengers and fragmented radio contact to coordinate their retreat. American forces successfully disrupted German withdrawal routes through artillery strikes and air operations. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force conducted repeated attacks on German columns, targeting vehicles, river crossings, and assembly points. Although not all strikes achieved significant material damage, the psychological impact and resulting disorganization further hindered German defensive preparations. In addition to air support, American artillery positioned on both sides of the Rhine provided long-range fire support, targeting German strongpoints identified through reconnaissance and intercepted communications. Within the former Remagen sector, engineers and support personnel worked to clear debris from the collapsed bridge and maintain the flow of troops and supplies across the pontoon and Bailey bridges. These temporary structures handled increasing volumes of traffic, supporting the logistical demands of the expanding offensive. Despite occasional interruptions caused by river conditions or minor structural issues, the crossing operations remained functional and reliable. By late March, daily traffic across the temporary bridges included hundreds of vehicles and thousands of troops, reinforcing the growing American presence east of the Rhine. German efforts to launch counterattacks diminished sharply following the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge. The units previously assigned to eliminate the bridgehead had depleted their resources and suffered significant attrition. Many formations were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength, with battalions reporting fewer than 150 personnel and lacking sufficient ammunition for sustained combat. The presence of additional American divisions crossing the Rhine made further German attempts to retake the area untenable. German High Command therefore shifted its priorities toward regrouping forces deeper within Germany and attempting to establish new defensive lines capable of slowing the Allied advance. American ground operations continued to expand, capturing towns and strategic points that further threatened German defensive cohesion. The seizure of transportation hubs enabled more efficient supply distribution, while the occupation of elevated terrain improved artillery effectiveness. Reports from American units indicated increasing numbers of German soldiers surrendering voluntarily, particularly among replacement units and Volkssturm detachments. Many of these troops cited lack of supplies, inadequate training, and diminishing confidence in their ability to hold positions as key factors influencing their decisions. Civilian conditions in the region also reflected the shifting dynamics of the conflict. Residents of towns near Remagen emerged from shelters following the collapse of the bridge, attempting to assess damage and secure essential resources. While some faced property destruction due to artillery or air attacks, American command implemented measures to stabilize local conditions, including distributing limited quantities of food and medical supplies. German authorities, increasingly unable to maintain order in retreating areas, left many communities without administrative leadership. This vacuum contributed to population displacements as civilians moved away from areas expected to become active combat zones. As American forces advanced toward the Sieg River, they encountered more fortified German positions constructed along natural defensive lines. These positions, however, lacked the depth and strength necessary for sustained resistance. Counterattacks launched from these lines were typically localized and short-lived, often involving small groups of infantry, supported by a handful of anti-tank weapons. American artillery and maneuver tactics quickly neutralized these efforts, enabling continued progress into key sectors. The broader strategic consequences of the Remagen bridgehead became increasingly apparent by late March. The American presence east of the Rhine forced the German command to divert units from other critical sectors, including those facing the British and Canadian armies to the north and the American Third Army to the south. These diversions weakened German defensive capability across the Western Front, accelerating the collapse of cohesive resistance and facilitating the rapid Allied advance that would culminate in the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. By the end of March, the combat around Remagen had effectively shifted from contested fighting to a secure American-controlled crossing zone. The German forces in the area, unable to regroup or mount further counterattacks, continued withdrawing toward interior defensive lines. The disintegration of organized resistance revealed the extent of German operational exhaustion and the growing momentum of Allied forces. The next phase of the campaign would involve the exploitation of this momentum, transforming the Remagen crossing from a tactical opportunity into a decisive operational breakthrough. The long-term significance of the Battle of Remagen extended far beyond the immediate tactical gain of securing an intact crossing over the Rhine. The events surrounding the capture and collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge influenced the final trajectory of the Western Allied campaign, reshaped German defensive planning, and became a focal point of post-war analysis and military doctrine. For the United States Army, the crossing represented a rare convergence of opportunity, initiative, and logistical readiness. For Germany, it exposed the diminishing coherence of late-war command structures and the erosion of operational capability across multiple fronts. In strategic terms, the establishment of a bridgehead at Remagen accelerated the Allied timetable for entering central Germany. Before the capture of the bridge, Allied planners anticipated that crossing the Rhine would require large-scale amphibious operations involving several days of preparation, including artillery bombardment, smoke screens, and significant infantry casualties. The unexpected availability of an intact steel span enabled the Allies to bypass these requirements and begin crossing within hours. This allowed American forces to initiate the advance toward the Ruhr earlier than projected, creating pressure on German formations already struggling to defend multiple sectors. The establishment of additional pontoon bridges following the collapse ensured that the Remagen crossing remained one of the most vital logistical arteries for Allied operations in March and April. 1945, analysts later concluded that the ability to move troops, armor, and supplies across the river without delay contributed directly to the speed of the subsequent encirclement of the Ruhr. This encirclement, involving approximately 325,000 German troops, was one of the largest capitulations of German forces on the Western Front, and effectively eliminated the last major industrial and military complex capable of sustaining prolonged resistance. For German high command, the Remagen incident became a case study in the consequences of systemic military degradation. Post-war assessments conducted by German officers noted that the inability to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge resulted from a combination of insufficient explosives, disrupted supply routes, breakdowns in communication, and the fragmentation of engineer units. The attempts to demolish the structure highlighted the effects of Allied air superiority, which limited the movement of explosives and prevented timely reinforcement of demolition teams. Meanwhile, the German countermeasures, ranging from artillery bombardment to V-2 strikes and Mistral aircraft, demonstrated diminishing technological returns and the practical limitations of late war weapon deployment. Civilian communities near Remagen experienced lasting effects from the battle. Damage to local infrastructure, homes, and public buildings required years of reconstruction. The collapse of the bridge left debris scattered across the Rhine riverbanks, posing hazards to navigation and requiring extensive removal operations. Post-war administrations in Germany incorporated the site into reconstruction plans that balanced practical needs with memorialization of wartime events. As the region rebuilt, the former bridge towers became landmarks documenting the transitional period between conflict and recovery. In military doctrine, the battle influenced several areas of study, including river crossing operations, engineer support, explosive placement, and emergency bridge repair. The U.S. Army's Corps of Engineers incorporated lessons from Remagen into training manuals, emphasizing the importance of rapid assessment teams, structural monitoring tools, and secondary bridging systems. The German experience underscored the need for standardized demolition planning, redundancy in explosive placement, and coordinated command structures capable of functioning under sustained enemy pressure. These lessons contributed to Cold War-era doctrine on both sides of the Rhine, influencing NATO and Bundeswehr planning for potential river crossing operations. Historically, Remagen came to symbolize the broader collapse of German defensive capacity in the final months of the war. The engagement was frequently cited in post-war studies as evidence of how quickly defensive lines could fail when logistical systems were overwhelmed and command structures fragmented. The German legal and disciplinary response to the bridge's capture, resulting in the execution of several officers held responsible, highlighted internal tensions within the Wehrmacht, as leadership attempted to assign blame for outcomes shaped by systemic factors rather than individual decision-making. In the cultural sphere, the Remagen Bridge became a subject of films, documentaries, and historical exhibitions. These works examine the battle from various national perspectives, focusing on engineering challenges, tactical improvisation, and the broader context of the war's final stages. While interpretations varied, most depictions emphasized the unexpected nature of the bridge's survival and its outsized impact on the campaign in Western Germany. Long-term historical debates addressed questions related to strategic necessity and proportional impact. Some analysts argued that the Remagen crossing shortened the war in the West by facilitating rapid penetration of the German interior, while others emphasized that German defeat was already imminent due to developments on both the eastern and western fronts. Nevertheless, historians generally agreed that the crossing forced German commanders to divert significant resources at a critical moment, weakening their ability to defend other sectors. Commemorative efforts after the war included plaques, memorials, and exhibitions housed within the surviving bridge towers. These installations documented the chronology of the battle, the structural history of the bridge, and the experience of soldiers and civilians on both sides. Annual observances in the region contributed to ongoing reflection on the bridge's significance and its role in shaping the final phase of the conflict. The legacy of Remagen thus encompasses military, political, and cultural dimensions. The battle demonstrated how a single intact structure could influence operational planning across an entire theater of war. It revealed the cumulative effects of sustained logistical strain on a declining military power and highlighted the capacity of engineering units to reshape battlefield outcomes. As historians continue to analyze the events surrounding the Ludendorff Bridge, the crossing at Remagen remains one of the most studied and consequential river operations of the Second World War.